Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. I'm Martha Roth, Dean of the Division of the Humanities at the University of Chicago, and it's my great honor and privilege to welcome all of you this evening to our inaugural Vivekananda Visiting Professorship Lecture. The lecture title this evening is Making Hinduism a, quote, world religion, end quote, before and after Swami Vivekananda. And this will be delivered by Sir Christopher Bailey, our first scholar appointed as the Indian Ministry of Culture Vivekananda Visiting Professor here at the University of Chicago. We are very honored to have received this gift from the Ministry of Culture of India to establish the visiting professorship to honor and enrich our long distinguished history of scholarship in South Asian studies by inviting distinguished scholars from around the world to join us and our community and to participate in the intellectual life here on campus. I want to give my special thanks to the Consulate General of India, Dr. Asaf Saeed, for the Indian Ministry of Culture's generous gift that makes this lecture possible and, in fact, makes a great deal of our collaboration and cooperation possible. Thank you, Dr. Saeed.
Well, it is a great honor for me to have been asked to introduce formally our very distinguished speaker this evening, Professor Sir Christopher Bailey, the very Harmsworth Professor of Imperial and Naval History, University of Cambridge, and the inaugural holder of the Indian Government Ministry of Culture, visiting Vivekananda Chair at this university for this year and next. Professor Bailey is one of the most renowned historians of our times, but maybe by way of introduction, I could share a thought or two about what makes his work so not only distinguished, but also distinctive. It is not often that someone with a deep academic interest in the history of South Asia also becomes an authority on global and world histories. But when that happens, as it does only very rarely, the history of the world, that is, how we tell the history of the world, also undergoes a seismic shift. Bailey's approach to world history has accomplished two powerful methodological revolutions at once. His celebrated 2004 book, The Birth of the Modern World, 1780 to 1914, tells the story of modernity without putting any part of the world, least of all Europe or the United States, at the center of it. While his later 2011 monograph, Recovering Liberties, Indian Thought in the Age of Liberalism and Empire, illustrates, for one part of the world, an argument he proposed in 2004 that all local histories must also be told as global histories. That Professor Bailey was able to make a breach in the walls of the fortress of Eurocentrism in the academia is proven by the fact that this latter book was selected for publication in a series on political thought, Ideas in Context, edited by the very formidable Professor Quentin Skinner. Until that publication of Bailey's time, that series had remained remarkably and resolutely Eurocentric. If Professor Bailey's book numbers the 100th in that list of titles, it only goes to show for how long Eurocentrism has ruled the history of political ideas, and at long list how, thanks to the work of Professor Bailey, there is now a breach in its hegemony. Professor Bailey began his academic publishing career in 1975 with a book on the Indian city of Allahabad, a very significant book in the education of my generation of historians. But perhaps his most revolutionary book in South Asian history was the one that followed in 1983, Rulers, Townsmen, and Bazaars, North Indian Society in the Age of British Expansion, 1770 to 1870. This book changed our view of the Indian 18th century forever. Instead of looking on the 18th century as a period of secular decline from which British rule rescued India, Bailey showed us the many new developments that actually marked its century and that went on to have a palpable and determining impact on the history of how the British actually ruled India. It is not at all surprising that the Oxford University Press in India should have now declared the Indian edition of this book to be an Oxford perennial. And as an aside, I should proudly say that our colleague Muzaffar Alam's book also figures in that list. Time does not permit me to discuss all of Professor Bailey's significant and path-breaking publications, for I don't want to stand for long between you and the lecture we have all gathered to hear. But I would be failing in my duty if I did not mention some of the many awards, distinctions, and honorary appointments that have come Professor Bailey's way in recognition of his contribution to scholarship. This list again is too long for me to exhaust it in the time I have, but only to mention a few. Professor Bailey was awarded the D.Litt degree from Cambridge in 1998 and made a Fellow of the British Academy and the Royal Historical Society in the same decade. He won the Wolfson Prize for his lifetime achievement in the field of history in 2005. In 2006, he was elected Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature. In 2007, he was appointed Knight Bachelor for services to history outside of Europe. The next year saw him appointed Trustee of the British Museum, and the Medal of the Royal Asiatic Society followed in 2009. None of this would surprise you, but they would tell you why we elected unanimously to have him as our first inaugural holder of the Vivekananda chair, because we all felt that the spirit of global consciousness that actually Vivekananda himself embodied resonated with the spirit of a global approach to history that Professor Bailey takes. And we are all grateful to the Government of India for the gift that made this chair possible, and we were delighted and completely privileged that Professor Bailey accepted our invitation. Ladies and gentlemen, I present to you Professor Sir Christopher Bailey.
Dean Roth, Consul General Dr. Ausaf Saeed, Swami Vivekananda, Professor Stark and Chakrabarti, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honor and an enormous pleasure for me to give the first Swami Vivekananda lecture in the University of Chicago. I must first express my own deep gratitude to the Ministry of Culture of the Indian government for its enlightened humanism and generosity in establishing this chair. I must also thank my colleagues in South Asian languages and civilizations, both for their kind introductions today and also for the warm welcome I've received since I arrived in Chicago. As a historian, rather than a specialist on Indian religion, I decided that my most useful role for this lecture would be to try to broadly contextualize the emergence of ideas of Hinduism as a world religion. Here I'm taking up a theme developed in Julius Lipner's Hindus and later tersely expressed in his article, The Rise of Hinduism, or How to Invent a World Religion with Only Moderate Success. Lipner, using the image of the banyan tree, argues that Hinduism, as it developed, is best seen as a system of polymorphous monotheism. The branches of the tree were formed by the continuous growth and transformation of the meaning of Veda, or in another metaphor, the diffusion and dispersal of the notion of the holy river Ganga, which produced a decentralized network of spiritual essences. Equally, I'm taking rather further Tomoko Masugawa's concept of a colonial self-articulation in the history of religions. Now, this remains a highly contentious area, of course. Some scholars, including members of our own Asian and Middle Eastern studies faculties, see Hinduism in the classical and medieval periods as a contingent amalgam of sets of rites and practices, rather than a compact set of doctrines such as is supposed to characterize Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. In this analysis, the Vedas and Puranas were written byproducts of various priestly interventions and incantations rather than any kind of scripture. Again, some historians, notably Chicago's own Marshall G.S. Hodgson, whose work is seeing a revival, viewed any unifying themes that might be seen in Hinduism, including practice such as bhakti, devotionalism, and perhaps more plausibly Sikhism, as much later responses to the Islamicate world. Even for the 19th century, there's a debate as to whether Rammohan Roy's Brahmo Samaj or Dayananda's Arya Samaj were forms of Hindu revival or sub-religions with a largely separate character. Certainly, the continuation of a wide variety of different forms of faith and practice in what is called Hinduism, from yoga through the pantheism of Sankhya tradition to Vedantism and on to the continuing emphasis on rites and outward forms in the varieties of Sanatana Dharma, counsels against taking for granted homogeneity, let alone any essentialized meaning of Hinduism. After all, Ramakrishna himself spent some time as an adept of Sufi Islam. Finally, the rise of political Hinduism in the form of the Bharata Janasangh in the 1980s focused attention on what Christophe Jaffrelot and others have called Hindu nationalism. Mention of Ramakrishna brings me to one of the central themes of my lecture, which is to suggest that it was in the generation immediately before the First World War that Hinduism became both a public and a world religion in a more coherent sense than it had ever been before. Rather than Orientalists, colonial officials, or Hindu Unitarians, as Rammohan once called his followers, the active agents here, in both personal and ideological terms, were Indians and Indic ideologies, transformed and adapted to what I call the idealist moment before 1914. A key figure here will be Vivekananda himself, but I'll go on to discuss other developments which articulated a more coherent religious identity from a brotherhood of sects and faith forms constituting the Hindu archipelago. The role of Madan Mohan Malviya and the Hindu Mahasabha, and the powerful intellectual work of Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan, second President of the Republic. In other words, I want to consider further those Indian thinkers, teachers, and writers who, despite Hinduism's polymorphic character, were insisting that it was a world religion in the late 19th century and the early 20th centuries, both internally within India and outside. I'm interested in the ideological and political pressures they were under and let loose, the speech acts and the practices they adopted to emphasize a sense of coherence in Hinduism. Even if their work was only moderately successful, there's no doubt that Hindus now rightly feel that they are believers in and practitioners of a coherent world religion. The term world religion derives, of course, from Max Weber, who argued in a long tradition of European thought culminating in his own work, that Judaism, Islam, and especially Protestant Christianity were socially transformative world bodies of religion and practice, unlike Hinduism, which was supposedly otherworldly. This argument was posited first by Hegel, who had classified Hinduism as a dream religion, again in comparison with early Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. Whatever the situation in regard to ancient and medieval Hindu society, and there's a lot of discussion about this, there's no doubt that by the 19th century, Hindu leaders were projecting Hinduism as a radical and transformative world religion, precisely in Weber's sense. Rammohan himself called his followers Hindu Unitarians, working for good in this world. Aurobindo argued that all Hindus should be Kshatriyas, worldly Laukika Brahmins, such as the Chitpavans of Western India, and socially minded Vaishyas or merchants filled the ranks of the early Congress. The attraction of the Gita for Indian moderns lay in its argument that man could combine spirituality, or nishkam karma, with worldly action. This was a theme later taken up by Radhakrishnan. Indeed, in Radhakrishnan's words, we should withdraw from the world's concern to find the real and return to the world of history with renewed energy, which is at once spiritual and social, and which is likely to be the religion of the new world, which will draw men to a common center across the national frontiers. One aspect of the emergence of Hinduism as a world religion was its application to public ideology and the practice of welfare. Modern world religions have all engaged with politics directly or indirectly, whether this was in the form of Christian democracy, Zionism, or the Muslim Brotherhood. Hindus embarked on the same search for political significance. And I'm not only referring here to today's Hindu nationalism or Hindutva, which has received so much attention, but also to a broad church Hindu sensibility acting in Indian politics, or something that I've called Hindu populism. This effort called in turn for a clearer definition of what Hinduism as a system of belief and practice actually was. No doubt its polymorphous character has persisted. Nevertheless, more coherent representations of scripture, teaching, and public preaching have emerged in the last 2 centuries, even if these have not yet created a complete consensus. Finally, to be a world religion, Hindus needed to turn outward, receiving recognition from other religious communities at a world level, but also marking themselves off from them. This was Vivekananda's contribution above all. So I'll now talk about the change from the days of Rammohan Roy in the early 19th century through to Ramakrishna and Vivekananda. So I'll briefly mention some early to mid-19th century developments which provided a background for the later expansion of Hinduism onto a world scale. Evidently, it's impossible to avoid mention of Rammohan Roy, though in my view he needs to be put more clearly into the context of figures such as Bal Shastri Jampekar in Bombay and Coevals in Madras. Rammohan, along with Gandhi, must be one of the most overstudied figures in Indian history, but he nevertheless remains iconic. In the first place, he was grappling with a massive explosion of print culture and newspapers across India and the colonial world, much of it initially driven by Christian missionary activity. The need to put matters of religion and belief into newspapers and pamphlets, alongside political issues, transformed religion into an issue for the public sphere, debated in the press and at public meetings, creating a new locus for religion beyond the temple, tirtha, or domestic altar room. This was a revolutionary moment. Not only did it create the notion of religious reform, though in fact Rammohan denied that he was a reformer, but parallel to this, there emerged the notion of a generalized orthodoxy. So, for instance, Rammohan's many publications were soon matched by the Dharma Sabha's Samacha Chandrika, while members of the new, now self-consciously orthodox middle class established a library in Calcutta to protect ancient religion and fight off Christian missionary attacks. To this extent, a set of religious publics began to form in a manner quite distinct from the earlier guru-led spiritual movements, such as those of Chaitanya, Kabir, or earlier Bhakti teachers. These new elements of public Hinduism were, moreover, politicized in a manner in which the Mughal Emperor Akbar's discussion with Jain and Vaishnavite sages had never been. Rammohan, for instance, linked the corruption of Vedantic religion to internecine class conflict, followed by Muslim and British invasion, which had destroyed what he called the ancient Hindu constitution. Similarly, opponents of Brahmo Samaj, attempting to end racial discrimination in the selection of grand juries on the grounds that Hindus could not take a binding oath, and they argued that pious Hindus would never assent to caste and racial mixing in such institutions. So we have a conflict here. They lined themselves up with British Tory politicians and the despotism of the East India Company. One particularly important theme which helped to define the emergence of public Hinduism through to mid-20th century debates on the Hindu Code Bill was, of course, the status of women, their right to inheritance, child marriage, and in Rammohan's time, the issue of sati, or widow burning. I need hardly belabor the point, except to note that the culture wars between the newly coined reformers following Rammohan and Dwarkanath Tagore later were again opposed by middle-caste traditionalists who were creating a normative code for Hindus. Neoconservatives had begun to use the same language of rights as the liberals. They were indeed modern thinkers in the broader sense. So the Samachar Chandrika claimed that the abolition of sati was tantamount to attacking the souls of the subject. A Brahmin wrote in the newspaper Harkaru, arguing that there was no justification for intervening in sati because a father would prefer to see his daughter burned than become a prostitute. Here, a sociological and secular argument melded with one based on karma. Bengal has long been overrepresented in debates on the emergence of public Hinduism during this period. So I'll mention the case of Bal Shastri Jambekar, an early Bombay liberal and critic of British racism. Jambekar several times alluded to the sati debate, but sati was not a particular prevalent invented tradition in Western India. Instead, the closest parallel to Rammohan's campaign was Jambekar's assault on the Nach, from Nachna, of course, the trafficking in young dancing girls for displays at marriages and festivities of princes, big Bombay merchants, and lascivious British officers. This form of slavery, Jambekar's newspaper argued, was revolting and pernicious. It destroyed families, encouraged laxity of public morals, but was also abhorrent to a well-regulated mind. Here, as in other issues of morality, we catch echoes of the vigorous notions of proper spirituality in the Western Indian bhakti or devotional tradition. But this was again transformed by attacks on Hindu corruption and bad Muslim and British government. The Nach violated appropriate religious rituals by being mixed up with them at marriages. This was a liberal project which combined Western and Brahminical conceptions of disciplinarity. In Madras, meanwhile, and even before 1860, figures such as Lakshmanarasu Chetty were constructing their own forms of South Indian Hinduism, in which the corruption of belief and practice by Brahmins, rather than by the Muslims or even the British, was emerging as a theme. These new forms of public belief, aired in the press and public meetings, in schools and colleges, were of course varied, yet they all represented attempts, unsuccessful or not, at promoting a more coherent form of public Hinduism. One final feature of this early and mid-19th century pattern of various varied homogenizations within polymorphic monotheism was the beginnings of the representation of Hindus overseas and Hinduism. Of course, Indic religious practices had been widely diffused into Burma, the Malay world, and beyond by generations of Hindu trading families. Equally, the European Orientalists had established Hinduism as a category of debate and analysis even before the high tide of Enlightenment and colonial conquest. Yet the appearance of what I call counter-preachers in Europe and the Americas was of great significance, both because they almost inevitably were called, or called themselves, representatives of Hinduism. These figures began to adopt a decidedly ethical discourse of religious difference. And this asserted, you Christians claim to be ethically superior, but when we see the way you live, your greed, vile habits, murder of animal kind, and dishonesty, the superiority in ethical, not just theological terms, of our religion, which we have to call Hinduism, becomes clear. As Lind Zastupul has shown, Rammohan, speaking in London, Bristol, Paris, and at least in spirit in Boston, was in many ways the first counter-preacher. Many Americans wanted to take him as a Unitarian, given his dissent from the doctrines of Christ's divinity. In a process of self-categorizing, he found himself bound to say that he was not a Unitarian, but a Hindu Unitarian. A generation or more later, Keshub Chandra Sen brought counter-preaching to a new pinnacle by traveling across Asia, including Ceylon and to Britain, promoting his idea of proper religion and the good life. Sen distinguished between Bengal spirituality and that of Bombay, Madras, and Ceylon. He also has comments on the backwardness of caste practices in Madras and the subservience of Bombayites to the local British. Sen represented himself as Indian and Hindu in the British context, but it's significant that he also attempted to create a norm of right conduct and belief to be applied in India and Ceylon. So the recreation of Hinduism was both an internal and a transnational phenomenon. So I now move on to Vivekananda and Hinduism as a world religion. All these forms of transformation and partial homogenization within the archipelago of Hindu belief and practice were seen in the career of Vivekananda himself. The use of publicity in the press, the political turn, an emphasis on ethics and counter-preaching to the West. The transition from Ramakrishna's multifaceted, mystical and individualistic practice to the man who created the Ramakrishna Mission announced the final emergence of Hinduism as a public world religion, both as a result of the coherence of his own program and also because of the idealist turn of transnational thought at this transitional moment before the First World War. Vivekananda's role as the public face of Vedantic Hinduism has never been eclipsed in the century or more since his death. Quite recently, a fierce debate broke out between Outlook, a leftist magazine, and the centre-right India on the occasion of the 120th anniversary of Vivekananda's journey to Chicago. The Radical Journal accused him of being a Hindu supremacist and defender of caste. The right wished to appropriate him as an icon of modern India in the Hindu tradition. Both these traditions are rather anachronistic. Vivekananda saw Advaita Vedanta as the supreme religion whose combination of rationality and spiritual insight made it the key to the summation of all religion. This was not a supremacist position of the sort advanced by the later exponents of Hindutva. Equally, Vivekananda, like Gandhi and other commentators of the time, believed that caste, properly understood, reflected a rational ordering of people's various abilities. Dubious as this is to us today, it didn't constitute an unthinking conservative defense of caste as a system of social dominance. This debate, however, is an indication of the continuing resonance of Vivekananda's name and his reputation. An important point is that as the face of Hinduism, Vivekananda's reputation was to a significant extent made outside India initially, particularly in the USA, and only later projected back to India. His conception of Vedantic religion and its relationship to politics and social service must therefore be put into the context of global idealism. I'll then discuss some other figures who might seem to be rootless cosmopolitans, to use a phrase beloved of today's anthropologists, but were definitely trying to put down roots, like Lipner's banyan tree. Vivekananda arrived at Chicago in 1893, attracted to the notion of presenting Hinduism at the world's Parliament of Religions. The meeting was a manifestation of that desire to establish international connections, which was violently shattered by the disaster of the First World War, but then reconstituted in the form of the League of Nations. The idea originated with Charles Carroll Bonney, president of the International Law and Order League, who was also active in US progressivist politics. Bonney's successor, J.H. Barrows, pastor of the First Presbyterian Church of Chicago, aimed to bring together leading representatives of the great religions of the world, as he put it. In a sense, therefore, Vivekananda's progress from sleeping in a box or a barrel on the Chicago lakeside to become a revered figure at the Congress itself represented Hinduism's own transition from a polymorphic network to a world religion. That the Parliament met in Chicago was of significance to Indians who already saw the USA as the land of the future. American academic institutions, drawing on German scholarship, had transformed the study of Sanskrit into a particularly American tradition. Philology was the master discipline, as it had been for early Hindu sages. At the same time, the melding of scientific theories and comparative religion in advanced Protestant circles in the USA was attractive to Indian intellectuals and preachers who rejected any division between science and belief in their search for the underlying unity of being. Following the transcendentalist tradition of Thoreau, Hopkins' Ethics of the Hindus, and Emerson's varieties of religious experience, it created a receptive environment for Vivekananda's doctrine. For instance, the Harvard graduate Philosophical Club invited him to lecture to them. The Brooklyn Ethical Association, addressing our Indian brethren of the great Aryan family, cited the favorable response of the dean of the Harvard Divinity School to this, quote, missionary from India to America. On a more sober note, this is a reminder that the classification of Hinduism as a world religion outside India, and even within it, was at least indirectly related to the rise of Aryan race theory, not just to the concept of Aryan language. The Brahmo Samaj and the Arya Samaj had created civil society organizations, promoted education and built libraries. More traditionalist Hindus had also founded societies dedicated to the benefit of the public. The various Hindu sabhas established to help pilgrims find food and shelter at the Prayag Magh Mela were cases in point. Seva, or service of the gods, had become lok seva, service of the people in the name of God, by the end of the 19th century. Even the Servants of India Society, founded by the agnostic G.K. Gokhale, was consciously molded and modeled on the Society of Jesus, and its co-workers took a quasi-religious oath on joining it. The Ramakrishna Mission organization took this several stages further, establishing a network of missions across India for the promotion of education and right living. Vivekananda was particularly insistent on the promotion of the eternal principles of spiritual education. Classes, he said, should promote the teachings of Chaitanya, the Buddha, Jesus, Nanak, Sri Ramakrishna, and others, though only Vedanta could unlock their essential unity. Water was the same whether it was termed jal, aqua, or pani, he said. Monism and spiritual variety were wholly consistent. At some level, Vivekananda and his closest disciples had become aware of the emergence of socialism in the West and parts of the colonial world. He once or twice used the term himself and also transformed it into an Indian form by declaring that this was the age of the Shudra, or common man. Now I suppose we would say Admi. And this statement contrasts with Aurobindo's exhortation to all Indians to become Kshatriyas. Uplift of the poor was therefore a key principle of the mission. Science-minded progress was an essential feature of this project, for the doctrine of Maya was not license for inaction. Rajas, intellectual quickness and passion, should be set against ignorance and obtuseness. Vivekananda's rules and regulations of the Belur Mat stated that the brahmacharyas should take steps to remove poverty, but before flooding country with socialistic and political ideals, they should deluge the country with spiritual ideas. Elsewhere, he stated that socialism was, I quote, worth trying, that half a loaf was better than none, and that any socialist program should be built on Advaita Vedanta. Still, the underlying political intention was also brought out by the assertion that by injuring others, you injure yourself, a covert denunciation of colonialism. And we find a rather ambivalent view of colonialism in his work. On the one hand, he attacks the British constantly for their greed and their concern with everything other than spirituality. But on the other hand, he says the British, perforce, have made us think about the rest of the world. Another feature of the message which chimed with worldwide social change was Vivekananda's emphasis on the role of women as bearers of knowledge and the fount of education. The figure of the mother as deity had been central to Ramakrishna's own epiphany. Now it became material in the practice of the mission. In trying to understand the promotion of Hinduism as a world religion during the idealist moment of Vivekananda's mission, it's important to see it not simply as an aspect of a kind of happy-clappy but unfortunately aborted interfaith communion. Many of the participants in the World's Parliament of Religions and consequent debates were determined to assert the unique truth or even dominance of their own religions. Christians, noting the audience that Vivekananda drew, accused him of being not orthodox enough, and they implied Hinduism was much nastier than reflected in his genial Hindu supremacism. This in turn encouraged the Swami and his avid readers in India to assert that very unity of Hinduism itself. Nevertheless, religious conflict was and always has been an essential feature of the promotion of religion. Syed Amir Ali was at this very time denouncing Hinduism as a static and backward medieval system, unlike Christianity and Islam. More pertinent in this case was the gradual estrangement between Vivekananda and Dharamsala, who had attended the World's Parliament as representative of Buddhism. Initially, Dharamsala had praised Vivekananda's promotion of the religions of the East, but the Swami was deeply hostile to Buddhist attacks on the idea of God-made man, either in the case of the Hindu avatars or of Jesus himself. The result was a growing controversy which contributed to some extent to the political difference which developed between Hindus and Buddhists in Ceylon. Indeed, the theological and ethical construction of a more homogeneous world religions has inevitably led to fissures and conflicts between them, a point which hardly needs to be stressed today. The rift between Dharamsala and Vivekananda was followed by the gradual disillusionment of Rabindranath Tagore, who had once been uplifted by Okakura Kakuzo's version of Pan-Asianism, underpinned by the deep theological unity of Hinduism and Buddhism. As he grew older and observed the rise of Japanese imperialism in the Far East, Tagore was increasingly reminded of the supposedly atheistical tenets of Buddhism. The tension between the accommodation of different religions and the conflicts between them was common in the idealist age of the 1890s and 1900s and contributed to the emergence of a more homogenized Hinduism. Theosophy, especially in the hands of Annie Besant, promoted itself as a kind of master script for comprehending all religions, of which Hinduism was the most universal. By the 1900s, however, figures such as Madan Mohan Chatterjee and his coevals in Madras were proclaiming themselves Hindu theosophists, adopting earlier theosophical borrowings from the evolutionary theory, but abandoning the more bizarre doctrines about gurus in Central Asian caves, for instance. Later theosophists, such as Bhagavan Das, melded Hindu theosophy with socialism. Ananda Coomaraswamy followed Vivekananda and the early Okakura himself in pointing to the common origin and similar sensibilities of Hinduism and Buddhism, and stating that Ceylonese are Indians. Sister Nivedita, a devotee of Vivekananda, represented Hinduism's international face, but also moved it away from cosmopolitan theosophy and closer to the Indian nationalist sentiment of the Swadeshi era. To Indians alone has been given the boldness that could abolish mental barriers between the sacred and the secular, she intoned. Now I'm now moving on to Madan Mohan Malaviya and Hindu populism and the body of India. This third section of my lecture concerns what is arguably a further key development in Hindu and Indian political thought in the 2 decades before the First World War. The emergence, particularly in Upper India, of a strain of popular Hindu ideology which inflected the political attitudes of moderate Congress people and various later movements, versions of the post-colonial right-wing parties such as the Janata Dal and the BJP. This version of Hindu-derived citizen activism, one of the main proponents of which was Madan Mohan Malaviya, has tended to be marginalized in many of the teleological accounts of the rise of the Hindu right. Secular and leftist historians have exaggerated the extremism of popular sentiment, which they castigate along with the Muslim League and the British for the disaster of partition. The narrative is clear, but too linear. British Orientalists, it claims, established simplistic categories of Hindu and Islamic thought in India based on classical texts. During the late 19th century, and particularly during the Swadeshi era of the 1900s, misguided nationalists insisted on the use of Hindu symbols and themes, giving further ammunition to the elitist Muslim League. Malaviya, allegedly a Hindu elitist and communist even, helped found various organizations, culminating in the Hindu Mahasabha, which paralleled and merged with a strain of proto-Hindutva promoted by Savarkar and Golwalkar. Now, one of the problems with this easy slippage between pre-war activism of Malaviya and his co-workers and the post-1980 proto-Hindutva ideologues, with whom Malvier was certainly associated, is this. Christophe Jaffrelot is surely right when he disavows any easy classification of Golvaka and Savarkar as fascists. For a start, they didn't have a clear principle of Führerprinzip, yet their understanding of the Hindu was subtly different from Malvier's and many other members of the later Mahasabha. Savarkar seems to have understood the Hindu as an ethnic category which had evolved through time. He was much less concerned with the doctrine, let alone ritual practice of Hinduism. At times, he was even prepared to incorporate Buddhists into the Hindu, that is, the original Indian category. This classification was akin perhaps to the notion of Germanism or Gallicism as used in the late 19th century in European theories which had ethnic undertones. It was a physical and social rather than a religious category. Moreover, wherever Hindus had settled, whether as far north as the Khyber Pass or as far east as Malaya, these lands became the lands of the Hindus. At least before 1914, Malvier had authored a cultural and religious understanding of the Hindu which was subtly different from proto-Hindutva and chimed with the idealist age. For him, Hinduism was a set of sentiments reflected in ritual practices which bound Hindus to the particular geography of Bharat, established around the holy places of pilgrimage from the Himalayas to the Cape Comorin, and was associated with the holy tales of the Puranas. The emphasis in the thought of Malvier and his co-workers, such as Indra Narayan Dwivedi or Purushottam Das Tandon, on devotional practice, astrology, Jyotish, and ritual recitation, marks it out not only from Savarkar's Hindutva, but also from the Arya Samaj, the Brahmo Samaj, and other forms of modernized Hinduism, even from Vivekananda's own movement. Those Hindus who emphasize ritual practice as much as ideology or politics were often called Sanatan Dharmis, a term which only later came to mean rigidly conservative. Yet Malvier's strain of Sanatani practice was perhaps more flexible in many respects, especially in regard to temple entry by untouchables. It also gained strength from its close association with a movement for the Hindi language and from its association with cow protection. Malvier himself founded a cow shelter in Allahabad alongside an orphanage to save Hindu children from the missionaries. By contrast, Arya Samajis, especially in the Punjab, were little concerned with Hindi, many of them continuing to speak Urdu or Punjabi. Equally, many of these modernist sectaries, Brahmo and Arya, were chary of cow protection societies, Gorakshini Sabhas, or alternatively, like Dayananda, turned cow protection into a form of what might be called humoral utilitarianism, which stressed the cow's social use as a provider of milk rather than its dharmic status. So my lecture now takes up some of Malvier's broadly conservative but inclusive populism. First, his emphasis on pilgrimage and ritual practice as a way of embodying and re-empowering the Hindu people. Here it might be useful to introduce the concept of meaningful practices to pair with the idea of speech acts, which has been used with such success by European intellectual historians. This term would be appropriate to describe actors in most world societies throughout history, and even for northwestern Europe before the age of Locke. People convey ideas through demeanor and gesture just as much as through texts and ideas. They act in society in the same way. In many ways, we learn more from Malvier's ideology, from his practice, than blandly liberal English speeches or even his Hindi works. So when Malvier cooked his own food throughout his life, while distant from his family, he was making an ideological point about the centrality of personal purity, particularly in the Brahminical tradition. Savarkar, by contrast, displayed much less concern with ritual purity and even dined with lower castes on occasions. When Malvier cut off communications with a great early nationalist patron, the Raja of Kalakanka, because the Raja had drunkenly abused his mentor, Pandit Ayodhya-nath, he was making an equally strong point about right behavior and self-control. For Malvier, similarly, Hindu nationality was not an ethnic belief about the genetic spread of Hindus across South Asia. It was a belief in the mutually energizing properties of the act of pilgrimage when pure bodies were exposed to the holy waters of bathing places such as Vrindavan, Benares, and above all, the Sangam at Allahabad, where the festivals of Kumbh and Magh Mela were held. His political speeches and journeys around India were always mapped onto the geography of holy places where he made oblations and said prayers, in concert with sannyasis, Brahmins, pious laymen, and later the Shankaracharyas of other great shrines of Bharat Mata. Malavia constructed his career around the protection and proper regulation of holy sites and temples, which lay at the heart of his civil activities, from the Prayag Hindu Samaj of the 1880s to the Hindu Sabha and Mahasabha after 1915. A prime example of this sort of activity was his campaign, which culminated in 1916 to protect the free flow of the water of the Ganga at the holy place of Haridwar from intervention by the Public Works Department. Another goal of man, according to the Hindu tradition, was knowledge or gyan. Here again, Malavia organized his career around the propagation of a modernized form of classical Hindu education. Beginning with himself, he committed substantial parts of the Bhagavad Gita and the Manusmriti to memory. He was instrumental in reintroducing the use of Sanskrit texts into decisions made according to Hindu law in the High Court of Allahabad. He helped develop the Allahabad Bharti Bhavan Library as a repository of Sanskrit and Hindustani learning, though significantly he opposed the over-Sanskritization of the emerging standard Khariboli Hindi. Here, along with colleagues such as Balakrishna Bhatta and the great Hindu literary man Harish Chandra, the aim was to make modern, Adhunik Hindi out of classical themes and practices and make it more accessible to a wider range of Hindu people. Malavia adopted Harish Chandra's mantra, "The advancement of the mother tongue lies at the root of all progress." Again, despite their conservative hue, the Hindu associations which Malavia was associated with distributed the Vedas and other classical texts to pilgrims at the holy places and others, something which was straightforwardly orthodox would not have done. A similar intellectual flexibility informed his efforts to establish the Benares Hindu University, in which he was prepared to work together despite serious differences with Annie Besant and other theosophists. Now, I've called this whole train of thought and social practice Hindu populism because by the beginning of the 20th century, it had turned outward, recruiting petty urban and rural Brahmin and Kshatriya members, and later substantial peasants. It represented a transformation of Indian liberalism less obvious than the idealism of the Bengal Swadeshi ideologues, but equally important. Francesca Orsini has shown how Malavia's Hindi disquisitions, or Parjachantra, on public life, in which the subjects express their views to the ruler, is significantly different from democracy in its emphasis on one's ability to rise above personal interests and partisanship. It parallels Coomaraswamy's distinction between Indian cooperation and the dominance of competition in Western industrial democracies. Again, politics was to be turned outward to the pious and frugal Hindu populace. Malavia's younger aides were responsible for establishing the first peasant association, or Kisan Sabhas, in the environs of Allahabad, and organizing campaigns for Hindi and primary education in district boards, particularly amongst local Brahmins and Rajput small proprietors, substantial farmers and rural teachers. Now, neo-Marxist designations are no longer favored by historians, but it doesn't detract from the autonomy of the power of ideas to remark on the petit bourgeois character of this whole movement and the reception of its ideas. The Malavias themselves were Brahmins, of course, but Madan Mohan's brother worked as an agent of the largest grain trader in Allahabad, Lala Manohar Das, who was also a patron of Hindu organizations and the early Congress. Another brother worked in the railway mail service. As this type of broad church Sanatani Hindu movement gathered strength after 1900, it became popular amongst middle and lower caste rural people, now called OBCs, Kurmis and Ahirs in particular. Inevitably, however, consciously or not, this embodied Hindu piety became disturbing for Muslims. Malviya was never communal in any simple sense, in my view. He often cooperated with Muslims in political movements, particularly with the Shiites of Awadh and the suburban Allahabad villages. Yet his association with the early Congress was partly impelled by his fear that the British had, quotes, turned towards the Muslims in the 1880s. Equally, his support for the equality of scientific Nagri script as court character in 1900, and his opposition to separate electorates for Muslims in 1909, and his campaigns for the reconversion of lower castes from Islam to Hinduism, Shuddhi, all speak to a prejudice, in Gadamer's sense, which was expressed in the rallying cry, Hindu, Hindi, Hindustan. Malviya's speeches and writings constantly alluded to themes of karma, rebirth, and mukti, or spiritual liberation. He rarely engaged intellectually with Muslim forms of spirituality, to the extent that many of the Bengali public men, and Gandhi and Vivekananda himself, often did. In all these ways, Malviya's Hindu populism was the linear precursor to 20th century Hindu majoritarianism in its key North Indian homelands. The politics of the 1920s and 30s, opposition to Congress alliance with the Khilafat movement and the communal award, brought him into communication with self-styled prophets of Hindutva, notably Savarkar and Golwalkar. But he was never wholly at one with their ideologies and practice. Now I go on to my final section, Hinduism as a world religion beyond the idealist moment. It would be impossible to write of Hinduism as a world religion in the 20th century without mentioning Mohandas Gandhi, though he must count as an idiosyncratic Hindu, to say the least. Yet recognized across the world as a Hindu, he was nevertheless one of the last great counter-preachers who often unintentionally promoted Hinduism on the world stage. Whether appearing at constitutional conferences, deploring the poverty of the British working class, or at meetings with Mussolini, he took the message earlier promoted by Keshub Chandra Sen, Vivekananda, and even Tagore to new audiences. Hinduism came to be associated with his newly coined doctrine of satyagraha and self-sacrifice in the minds of distant public figures, from Martin Luther King to Mandela. After his death, the philosopher and later president of India, Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan, was able to write, "The fact of Gandhi is a challenge to the exclusive claims of Christianity." Within India, Gandhi's role as an exponent of Hinduism was, however, quite ambiguous. Rising to fame with a Muslim cause, the Khilafat, calling from time to time on the Buddha, Christ, and Tolstoy, he was eventually assassinated by a radical Hindu, Nathuram Godse, in the name of Hinduism. Gandhi indeed called himself a Sanatani. Following Vivekananda, he emerged from the ashram to promote social service, in his case, khadi, and the practice of walking in support of righteous causes. Like Vivekananda again, he sought to transform caste from a suppressive hierarchy to a reflection of righteous moral and intellectual difference. This position initiated the rupture with B.R. Ambedkar, whose later espousal of Buddhism itself helped further to constitute Hinduism as a separate world religion. In deportment, clothing, and commitment to celibacy, too, Gandhi took on the guise of a classic sannyasi. Yet in some ways, and in many other respects, as Faisal Devji shows, he disavowed any political role as a Hindu. He didn't represent the Hindus as opposed to Muslims, since for him nationality was a negative quality of common suffering and had nothing to do with numbers or sectarianism. Even when it came to Hindu scriptures, he claimed that the Gita was not particularly a Hindu book, but, I quote, rather a non-sectarian teaching of ethics. This is a work which persons belonging to all faiths can read. It doesn't favor any sectarian point of view. It teaches nothing but pure ethics. To this extent, Gandhi may have unintentionally promoted Hinduism as a world religion, but not as a faith or a set of doctrines. He was above all, perhaps, a moralist who drew particularly on Indic themes. Rather than dwelling on right-wing ideologues such as Shyama Prasad Mukherjee, Savarkar, or Hedgewar, for instance, my final example of public and political Hinduism are represented by a constellation of figures which congregated around Jawaharlal Nehru during the independence struggle and his premiership. These figures were all broad-churched Hindus, but to one degree or another they espoused secularism, in the Indian sense, that allowed for public religions, but sought to adjust conflicts between them and the emerging secular state. This stance was significant in its significant contrast to the notion of laïcité in France, for instance, which disavowed displays of public religion. Gobind Ballabh Pant, for instance, Chief Minister of UP, deplored the Mahasabha's call for direct action against partition, but described Malavir as a Brahma Rishi. Gandhi, to him, was to be trusted because he had opposed cow slaughter. Priyag, Allahabad, was for him a holy place. Or again, take one of Nehru's closest economic advisors, D.R. Gadgil, an admirer of both Tilak and Harold Lasky. During the partition debate, he had stated in his Federal Problem in India, 1946, Muslims and Hindus in India must be considered as not forming one community, but two communities desirous of cultivating traditions which are in the main divergent. Now, I refer to these figures not because I want to throw doubt on the powerful influence of Indian secularism, but to show how Hinduism, as a world religion and a political religion, attempted to accommodate it. Vallabhbhai Patel and P.D. Tandon were both conservative Hindus in practice. Patel spent his days in British prisons reading the Gita and the Ramayana as inspirations for political action. Though Patel denounced the Mahasabha for posing as the only custodians of Hinduism, he clearly saw Hinduism as the key faith group in the subcontinent, opposing separate representation for Muslims and other religious minorities. Now, my final example is Sarvepalli Radhakrishnan, ambassador to the UN and the USSR, and second President of the Republic. Radhakrishnan embodied all the elements which denominated the emerging world religion of Hinduism. He further reflected on, even codified, Advaita Vedanta as its key component, while also bringing into close dialogue with moral philosophy in Oxford and through his publications. He acted as a counter-preacher in the manner of Keshub Chandra Sen and Vivekananda, chastising the West for its hypocrisy and violence. In this respect, he was perhaps the last of the counter-preachers, a figure beyond the idealist age. From the time of his early encounters with the claims of Christian missionaries, Radhakrishnan argued that Christ's revelation was not unique, but simply one example of the passage of the creative spirit through history, and that the kingdom of heaven is within all of us. Or, by the same token, that Sri Krishna is a living presence. If all men were avatars of a supreme and rational deity, then no one people should rule over another, and liberal democracy was the goal of the whole of humanity. To the Indian mind, he wrote, democracy was one aspect of moksha, the long tradition of religion and non-violence and freedom. Radhakrishna, moreover, promoted Nishkam Karma as a public doctrine of Hindu humanitarianism, both in the United Nations and in Stalin's USSR. It seems appropriate to end with Radhakrishna in the 1960s, at a time when all humanity, from Dag Hammarskjöld to George Harrison of the Beatles, had recognized Hinduism as a world religion, and when, despite the horrors of partition, various Hindu movements had established themselves within the subcontinent as activist social and political forces. None of this, of course, in any way detracted from its polymorphous and complex character. The broad church element fragmented between radical Hindutva and more inclusive forms of belief and practice following the foundation of the BJP and later the Ayodhya Mosque incident. The rise of the Maharishis in the 1960s and the role of diasporic Hindu communities, notably the Swami Narayanas of Gujarat, also tended to perpetuate complexity within the Hindu archipelago. There was even a point in the 1980s when the Ramakrishna Mission itself briefly decided to declare itself a religion separate from Hinduism, though mainly, it seems, for tax purposes. Nevertheless, it would be correct to conclude that even within the subcontinent, different strands of Hinduism as a public and world religion had become more coherent by the 1960s, and this remains the case today, even as the media and political parties continue to contest its meaning. Thank you very much.
some questions?
Yes, just a few questions. Yeah.
So Professor Bailey will take some questions, and we have about 10 minutes for the question and answer session.
Professor, yes, please.
Will you please explain why Ramakrishna Mission preferred to come out of Hinduism? Just now you mentioned.
Well, I think this was just a very limited thing that happened in the 1980s, and as I said, I think it was to do with issues of taxation. And it was possibly to do with the fact that there were more religious conflicts in the 1980s, but this failed, nothing came of it, and as far as I know, one would still regard the Ramakrishna Mission, and you can tell me better, as essential to the Hindu faith.
To my knowledge, the political pressure on our institutions, and in those days, the communist movement was going on, and the communists, they wanted to take care of all the institutions that were run by the Ramakrishna Mission.
Yes.
And we wanted to take the protection of the law by declaring as a minority. Because in the Indian constitution, minority has not been defined. So that minority among the Hindus, but not out of Hindus. So this I wanted to.
Thank you very much. That's very helpful.
Yes, Dan. Do you want to? Yeah, you want to use the microphone there? Or then others will be able to hear you. That's.
I just wonder if you could say more about what you currently referred to as the age of global idealism. What constitutes that as a distinctive sort of period, and some of the various respects in which idealism is the right phrase for referring to that?
Well, thank you. That's an interesting question. I mean,
Yeah.
Sorry. Oh, sorry. I've been thinking about this because it seems to me that from the 1880s, 1890s, in most world cultures, there is a movement away from any notion of individualism, liberal individualism, to something which stresses the embodiment of certain spirit, and very often the embodiment of that spirit within a nation, but also within a community or within a set of institutions. And I think we see that actually happening rather earlier in India than other parts of the world, when even in the 1960s, the 1860s and 70s, people like Keshub, Chandra and so on are saying, we can't have any of this liberal individualism. We have to be a community. This is the only way it can work. But I think this was a switch that is very evident in most societies by the end of the 19th century. It's aborted, of course, by the First World War, by the rise of a different form of socialism thereafter. But I would say even that early socialism from the 1890s to 1910s has that element of idealism about the importance of not just the individual, but the individual relating to the community, helping the community, and so on. We see it, for instance, in T.H. Green and other philosophers of that particular period, and, of course, in Emerson and American philosophers of the same period.
If you wouldn't mind introducing yourself.
Oh, introduce
Please.
myself?
Yeah, please. And then we'll go to Sandhya.
Hi, I'm Sandhya. I'm not a student here or anything. Just came over. So when you were talking about Manmohan Roy in the late 1800s, you commented on the different centers of reform for Hindu nationalism, mostly in Bengal, Bombay, and Madras. So can you comment on the characteristics of reform in South India and how it differed from, you focused mostly on the North, but can you talk about any differentiating characteristics of the South?
Well, thank you. I mean, that's a difficult question for me because I've always focused on North India. But it seems to me that there are obvious parallels in this movement towards a notion of the need for people to be represented. I think that's a very important component of South Indian political ideology in this period as well. I would say that it's quite interesting that very early on you get this sense of we need to emphasize the ordinary man once again. In this case, of course, the ordinary man turns out to be a non-Brahmin, which is why I mentioned this figure, Lakshmana Rasu Chetya, who was talking about the need to, as it were, move away from an elitist position and empower local people in the 1840s and 1850s, and came into contact with some of the important Bengali counter-preachers, as I call them, of that period. But I think, I think it's important to stress that even though there were significant differences across India in different regions, there was an emerging sense of how India must move ahead, and indeed there must be a representation on juries, on local bodies, and that was the key demand of this period across the whole country.
Sundar, if you wouldn't mind using the microphone.
I'm Sundar Visalinga. I just want to focus on this whole notion of world religion. So basically, the denial of this status to Hinduism, as you put it, was because of a certain lack of coherence as contrasted to the Abrahamic religions. And then the idea, the developments you speak of basically are that there is a tendency to somehow force-fit Hinduism into that mold of world religion which already pre-exists, and you showed all the stages of that. Now, basically, I want to make two statements in two opposite directions, because right now there are many Hindu intellectuals who say that Hinduism, quite apart from it being a world religion, there are many a growing number of Hindu intellectuals who basically say that Hinduism isn't even a religion. For example, Professor Bal Gangadhar, other people. So it's not even a religion, and they don't say this in a negative terms, they say it in a positive sense. And then on the other hand, the question is, what are the criteria that one uses to identify a world religion? And for example, in the case of Madan Mohan Malaviya, you said that if you want to find coherence, you try to find some coherence in Madan Mohan Malaviya, and the coherence was not to be found in what he said or whatever, but in his speech acts. So basically, what are the criteria? For example, if you want to raise Hinduism to the level of a world religion, should we look at doctrines? Because as you said right from the beginning, there was no coherence in the doctrines, etc. Or perhaps there is some other sort of feature or characteristic which one could look at, for example, when pushing further from speech acts, say a semiotic approach to religion, for example. Things would look very different, I think. When you compare religions using very different sets of criteria.
Well, thank you very much. And I think one of the important things that I was trying to suggest was that it was the recognition by other, quotes, world religions of Hinduism that was particularly notable during this period, and also the emergence of an ethical discourse, which was different from the type of debate that you were talking about earlier. And it seems to me that what we're seeing here is both the emergence of an ethical debate, in other words, speech acts, but also a much broader sense of what I call meaningful practices, the way that regional differences begin to break down, that people move across the whole continent much faster than they ever did before, that you have massive attendance at all the great festivals. And now that had begun to happen even in the Mughal period or even before, I think, but it becomes very, very much more notable during this period. But I quite agree that there are different ways of defining religion, but I think that partly as a result of the debate with missionaries and even the debate about the re-emergence of Buddhism, that there is some kind of notion amongst most Hindus of the late 19th and early 20th century that this is a world religion.
Okay, we'll make that the final question. Yeah, please.
Is that?
Yeah. Would you mind please introducing yourself?
Shiraz Hajiani from, Shiraz Hajiani from Near East Languages and Civilizations. Thank you for your talk and welcome back. In around the middle of the 19th century, in the Nile to Oxus region, there are people like Jamaldin Afghani and Muhammad Abdu who are doing kind of a similar thing in terms of calling for personal ijtihad and going back to the text at the individual level. So perhaps I see a similarity here. Could you perhaps reflect on that and specifically in terms of technological change? The fact that the printing press is available and there's a proliferation of printed materials that could be distributed, and also railroads are being built and communication is perhaps becoming a little bit easier. And the second component, education. To what extent these twin factors contributive to this sense of coherence and also a global world consciousness, if you will.
Thank you very much. I couldn't agree more with that. I mean, it seems to me that one could have done a similar type of paper or lecture, bringing people like Jamaluddin and others into this whole notion of the idealist age, of counter-preaching, of the creation of world religion. I think there's a slight difference in the sense that, as far as I understand it, Islam in South Asia as well is much more coherent from an earlier period, partly because of the role of the Mughal state and so on, that one has the ulama, and there's no real equivalent to the ulama, they're the Brahmins, but the Brahmins are different in different parts of the country. So I suspect that this coming together as a world religion was actually a recreation of something that was probably imminent there anyway in the case of Islam, but that there is a more substantive move in the case of Hinduism. But I certainly think that the point about education is a very good one, and there I would bring in the emergence of local institutions such as the ones that obviously the Ramakrishna Mission, but also even Malavir and his coevals are actually teaching Hinduism in schools, even if they're not government schools, even if they're local schools and so on. And of course, finally, the Benares Hindu University. And I think the story of the Benares Hindu University and the fact that this is recognized by the state, which at least formally is supposed to be non-sectarian, non-religious in any way, is a rather important development. And that, of course, comes in what I've called the idealist age.
Okay, so with that, we'll bring the Q&A session to a close. And friends, would you please join me in thanking Professor Bailey for this very illuminating